The wind came off the San Gabriel Ridge the way it always did in February, not as a single force but as a series of them overlapping, each one finding a different angle against the prefab walls of Forward Operating Base Kellner. Master Sergeant Dale Briggs had spent 14 years in uniform, and 11 of those years at high-altitude postings, from the Cunard Valley to the Cascades, and he had learned early that mountain wind was not a weather condition. It was a presence, something that arrived with intent and stayed without permission. He had also learned that the wind was an honest thing. It did not pretend to be something it wasn't. It did not soften itself for the sake of the people who had to work inside it. One of the things a man encountered at a forward operating base were the same way. The cold, the altitude, the particular quality of silence that settled over a compound after dark. All of them honest, all of them indifferent, all of them demanding that you deal with what was actually there rather than what you wished was there. He thought about that later when he tried to understand why the woman had registered as something different from the first moment he saw her. She was honest in the same way the wind was honest. She did not announce herself. She did not explain herself. She simply arrived and made clear, through the totality of how she moved and stood and looked at things, that she was exactly what she was, not one thing more, not one thing less, and that anyone who needed more performance than that was going to have to find their reassurance somewhere else. He was standing at the threshold of the Tactical Operations Center when he saw her. She came up the access road from the south gate alone. No escort, no one from admin meeting her at the perimeter. She carried a single canvas bag over her left shoulder, the strap worn smooth the way gear got worn when it had been used for years, not days. She wore a civilian cold weather jacket, dark charcoal, no patches, no name tape. Beneath a wool cap pulled low, her hair was dark brown, pressed flat against her forehead by the cold. She was somewhere in her early 30s. She moved without urgency. That was the first thing Briggs noticed. Nobody moved without urgency on a day like this. The temperature was 19 below. The mission clock on the TOC wall showed a window that was closing. 3 analysts behind him were running terrain overlays on dual monitors, and the low, steady hum of controlled stress had been in the room for 2 hours. And yet this woman was walking up the access road like she had all the time in the world, like the mountain wind and the cold and the operational tempo of everything around her were simply the conditions under which she was moving, not obstacles to move through. He blocked the doorway before she reached it. Advisory staff is billeted in the East Wing, he said. Operations is restricted access. She stopped, looked at him. Her eyes were gray and gave him nothing useful. Not hostility, not impatience, not the particular brand of wounded pride he usually got from contractors who hadn't yet learned what the words restricted access actually meant at a forward base. She reached into her jacket and produced a badge on a lanyard. He took it and read it. Sarah Calloway, Civilian Systems Analyst, Advisory Tier 2. He handed it back. Tier 2 advisory doesn't include TOC access. I know where the East Wing is, she said. Then you know where to go. She didn't argue. That was the part that stayed with him after he turned back inside, after the door closed behind him and the warmth of the TOC replaced the cold of the threshold. Most of them argued. They had letters. They had phone numbers. They had the name of someone 3 levels above his pay grade who had told them personally that all doors would be open. She had none of that. She took her badge back, looked at the closed door for a moment with an expression he couldn't name, and then turned and found a place to sit on the low concrete wall beside the entrance. In the thinning afternoon light, in the wind, in the cold, Briggs went back to work because there was work to do. Inside, the TOC was running its own particular version of organized crisis. Captain Nora Shelton stood at the terrain display with her hands braced on either side of it, her eyes moving between the topographic overlay and the drone feed cycling on the monitor to her left. She was 38, compact, with the economy of movement that belonged to people who had spent years in rooms where space and time were both scarce. She had been the base S2, the senior intelligence officer, for 7 months, and Briggs had learned in that time that she did not share information before she was ready to share it, and that her readiness had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule. On the monitor feed, the thermal imaging of the Coldwater Canyon showed a single moving signature, white hot against the gray cold of the stone walls, moving west toward the canyon's open end. The target was designated Alpha 7. His real name was Marcus Veld, 44 years old, logistics coordinator for an armed extremist network operating in the San Gabriel and San Bernardino ranges, a group that had moved beyond ideology into something more operationally serious in the past 18 months. Veld was not a fighter. He was the person who knew where things were. Supply lines, safe houses, transit corridors through federal wilderness areas. The kind of human infrastructure that a network needed to persist, and the kind that was almost impossible to reconstruct once it was gone. He was crossing Coldwater Canyon on foot, alone, and the drone had picked him up 40 minutes ago. The problem was the shot. The canyon's western exit opened onto a rock shelf, a natural platform of granite that offered a clean sight line for approximately 8 minutes if the target paused there. If the wind held, if someone with the right equipment and the right training was in position on the base's western observation tower in time to take advantage of it. The range from that tower to the far edge of the rock shelf was 2,240 meters. Sergeant First Class Danny Hayes, Phoebe Kellner's primary designated marksman, was in the medical bay with a fractured clavicle from a vehicle rollover 2 days prior. The secondary shooter had rotated out the previous week as part of a normal personnel cycle. The 3 remaining qualified riflemen on base had never attempted a shot beyond 1,400 meters. At 2,240 meters, in 17-knot crosswind with an inconsistent gusting pattern off the ridge, that gap was not closable with will or effort. It was a physics problem. Briggs was looking at the countdown on the wall, 29 minutes, when Shelton spoke without turning. "She'll still be there when you go back out." He looked at her. "You know something about her." Shelton didn't answer immediately. She tapped a key on her workstation, and a secondary overlay appeared on the terrain display. "Enough," she said. It was not an answer. Briggs knew it was not an answer. He also knew Shelton well enough to recognize that pressing the point right now would produce nothing except a delay he couldn't afford. He filed it, went back to the countdown. 28 minutes. Then the radio changed everything. It was the secure channel, the JSOC frequency, that only Briggs and the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Decker, had authorization to monitor. The channel that was used for operational coordination above the base's normal clearance tier. The channel that had been silent for 6 days. It crackled once, then a voice, clipped and flat with the particular quality of satellite compressed transmission. "FOB Kellner, this is Phantom Element Actual. Wraith 1 confirmed present position. Time sensitive. Acknowledge." The room went quiet the way rooms went quiet when something arrived that no one had prepared a category for. Briggs knew the term Phantom Element. It was a JSOC coordination element, a small, deliberately ambiguous organizational unit that handled assignments that didn't fit cleanly into the task force structure. He had worked adjacent to it twice in his career, never directly. What he knew about it came from fragments: a brief in 2021, a name mentioned in an after-action report, a reference in a classified document that he had read exactly once and been instructed not to reference again. Wraith 1 he had heard mentioned exactly once, in that same 2021 brief, described as a designation that existed in the JSOC assignment architecture, but carried no current personnel assignment. A ghost slot, a placeholder in the system for a capability that was either not yet filled or had been deliberately left empty for reasons the brief did not explain. He turned toward the door. Outside, the woman with no urgency was still sitting on the concrete wall in the wind. He went back out. She stood up the moment she heard the door open. Not startled, not rushing, just standing in the smooth single motion of someone who had been ready to stand for some time and was only now being given the reason. "Phantom Element is calling for Wraith 1, Briggs said. "I know." She picked up her bag. "I've been waiting for them to." "You knew they would call." "I knew the window. I've been counting it down since I came through the south gate." She looked at him, and for the first time there was something in those gray eyes beyond neutral assessment. Not quite impatience. Something closer to the particular focused energy of a person whose preparation has finally met its moment. "How long is the window?" 27 minutes. "Then we're done standing in the cold." He stepped aside. She walked through the door. Inside, Shelton looked up from the terrain display when the woman entered. Something passed between them, a look that Briggs caught the edges of without being able to read the center of it. Not surprise, not warmth. Something older and more complicated than either of those things. The look of 2 people who shared a history that had never fully resolved itself, who had arrived in the same room again and were taking the measure of how much that history still weighed. Shelton looked away first. Decker's voice came through the command channel. "Briggs, what is your status on Wraith 1 acknowledgement?" Briggs keyed the radio. "Wraith 1 is present, sir. She's in the TOC." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Then, "Good, get her briefed. You have 26 minutes." The woman set her bag near the door and looked at the terrain display. She looked at it the way people looked at things they already understood, not scanning for information, but confirming it. Her eyes moved from the canyon overlay to the drone feed to the shooter's range calculation that Briggs had written on the whiteboard in the corner. She stopped at the range calculation. 2240 meters, she said, to the western edge of the rock shelf. "Confirmed." Wind is reading at 17 knots on the base sensor array. Sustained 17 gusting to 21. She nodded slowly, not processing, confirming. Then she turned and looked at Briggs with the direct attention of someone who was deciding how much time the next question was worth. Your primary shooter is down. Who else? 3 qualified on base, max range 1400. She turned back to the display. The Western Observation Tower. That's the position. It's been decommissioned, Shelton said. It was the first thing she had said directly to the woman since she walked in. Structurally sound, but access ladder hasn't been maintained in 8 months. I'll manage the ladder. She said it without looking at either of them, without drama. The way a person said they would manage a thing they had managed many times before and did not consider worthy of discussion. Briggs didn't move yet. He recognized the pull of urgency, the clock and the mission, and the simple mechanical momentum of a problem that had just found its solution. He had felt that pull before, and he had learned to be suspicious of it. The momentum of a situation was not the same thing as sound judgment, and he had spent enough years in enough rooms to know that the two could feel identical right up until they weren't. He had also spent enough years to know when he was letting something other than judgment drive his hesitation. He thought about that too. He pulled the personnel file that Phantom Element had pushed through the secure channel when they had confirmed Wraith One's presence. Her name on the file was Sarah Corwin, not Calloway. The badge had been a functional fiction, not a lie exactly, but a door left deliberately ajar, a way of arriving without announcing. The kind of entry a person made when they had learned that announcing yourself sometimes closed the room before you could step inside. He read through the file quickly. Service record, clean and accomplished, running from enlistment to approximately 19 months ago. Multiple deployments, a string of commendations that were the kind given for specific and verifiable performance, rather than the kind given for being present in the right place during the right year. An operational specialty designation that required years of specialized training and a selection process that the Army did not make easy because the Army understood that the capability was not something you could manufacture in quantity, and so you had better make absolutely certain of the quality. At 19 months ago, the file stopped. Not ended, stopped. 1 page remaining. 1 line of text, record redacted. Below it, in the field that normally contained the authorizing signature, S2 FOB Kellner/Phantom Element Joint Order. S2 FOB Kellner. That was Shelton. He looked up from the file. Shelton was watching him read it. She had been watching him since he picked it up, with the patient attention of someone waiting for a specific page. Your signature, he said, keeping his voice level and low, pitched only for her. Yes, not suspended, not inactive, redacted. Yes. Why? Shelton held his gaze. Because that's what she asked for, and I owed her that much. 3 analysts were at their workstations 6 feet away. The drone feed cycled on the monitor. The countdown on the wall had 23 minutes left. Briggs looked at Shelton's face and saw nothing that was going to become a complete answer in the next 30 seconds. And he made the decision that a good NCO made when the clock and the mission and the incomplete picture were all present at the same time. He set that word aside, owed, and kept it close. It had an edge in it that pointed at something specific, and specific things had explanations, and he was going to hear that explanation before this day was over. But not now. He set the file down and walked to where Sarah Corwin was standing. I need a minute with you, he said. She looked at the clock, looked at him. 1 minute. He pulled her to the far side of the room, away from the analysts and away from Shelton, and he did something he did not typically do in operational settings. He asked the question he actually needed answered instead of the one protocol suggested he ask. You and Shelton, he said, what's the history? She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not hesitation, more like a person deciding how much truth a question deserved. Then she sat down on the edge of the nearest workstation, not because she was tired, but because whatever she was about to say required a different posture than standing. It came in fragments, not a story, but the outline of one, the way a person described a thing they had processed enough times to stop needing narrative arc around it. 19 months ago, a target brief for an operation she could not name. Shelton had been the S2. The brief identified a man, a logistics facilitator for an armed network, and classified him as hostile. The brief was clean, the intelligence was detailed, the confirmation process had been followed. She had been on overwatch for an insertion team. She had taken the shot when the window opened. 2 seconds later, a voice on the radio, not calm, not professional, something else. Abort, Sarah, abort. That's our man, he's agency. The man's name had been Matlin. He had been a CIA asset running deep cover inside the network for 11 months. He had been on a list that the brief had not included. He had been on that list because someone had either made an error or had chosen not to include it. And in either case, the outcome was the same. She told him this in the flat, careful voice of someone who had taken a thing apart and put it back together enough times to be no longer surprised by its pieces. No self-pity, no performance of what she had been through. Just the facts, arranged in their order. What he noticed was the language she used. She did not say the brief was wrong. She said she had not verified it herself. She did not say it was Shelton's fault. She said someone had either made an error or made a choice, and that both of those things produced the same outcome, and that the outcome was what she had to live with. She had made a decision about where to assign responsibility, and that decision did not let her entirely off the hook, because she was a professional who had known that independent verification was possible and had not done it, and she was not the kind of person who absolved herself of what she could have done differently. "You went dark," Briggs said. "I requested voluntary stand-down. 19 months. I needed to understand what had happened well enough to be certain it couldn't happen again." She looked at her hands, not with distress, with the same clinical assessment she applied to wind calculations and terrain data. As if her hands were instruments to be evaluated rather than appendages to be performed for. "There are things you can rebuild quickly and things that take the time they take. I gave it the time it needed." "And now?" She looked at him, direct, unhesitating. "I rebuilt it. How do you know?" A pause that was not uncertainty. The pause of a person who had anticipated this question and had a real answer for it rather than a reassuring one. "Because I've been in position 3 times in the past 8 months, in the field, at actual range, under actual conditions. I verified it myself." She paused. "I don't accept the system's assessment of my readiness. I assess my own. That's what the 19 months taught me." "The weight," he said. "Is it still there?" She looked at him. The question had surprised her, not because it was intrusive, but because it was precise. "Yes," she said. "The weight is supposed to be there. The weight is how you know you understand what you're doing." "And the doubt?" A beat. "The doubt is not in my hands, not anymore." 22 minutes, he said. She stood up. "Then stop wasting them." He stepped back, not as retreat, as acknowledgement. Before she moved toward her bag, he said, "You'll have radio contact throughout. Wind data, atmospheric readings, anything you need from down here." Something shifted in her expression, small and almost invisible, but there, the particular recognition of a fair arrangement offered without condition or performance. She had been waiting for someone to say something like that instead of asking her to justify what she already was. "I don't need you to believe in me," she said. "I just need you not to get in my way." "That I can do." She pulled her bag off the floor and moved to the terrain display one more time. Shelton had not moved from her position. Corwin looked at the topographic map, the canyon, the rock shelf, the sight line from the western tower to the target's projected position. Her left hand rose almost automatically and traced the contour line of the ridge, index finger moving along the elevation data with the familiarity of someone tracing a road they had driven many times and could find without looking. Not studying, confirming. Then she stopped. Her finger rested on a point on the map approximately 4 kilometers northeast of the current target area. A ridgeline notation, Crawford 7. The elevation marker showed 8,400 feet. Rough terrain, north-facing slope, the kind of ground that held snow through March and offered natural concealment in 3 directions. She stayed very still, not motionless the way a person went motionless when they found something unexpected. Motionless the way a person went motionless when they found something they had been looking for without fully knowing they were looking for it. Shelton's voice came from just behind her left shoulder, pitched low, pitched only for Corwin. "You've been here before." Not a question. "Operation Kingfisher." Corwin's voice had a quality that Briggs had not heard in it before. Not softness exactly, but depth, like something that had been kept at a careful distance was being allowed one step closer. 19 months ago, I was overwatch for the insertion team, this canyon, this approach corridor. Matlin was the target we were tracking. We didn't know what he was. Shelton said nothing. The silence between them had the texture of a conversation that had been waiting a long time to happen and had not yet found its form. Briggs did not move. He stood at the edge of that silence and let it exist, because some silences needed to exist before anything useful could follow them. "Ridge Compact is still operating in this area," Corwin continued. "Alpha 7 isn't a coincidence. Veld isn't just a logistics coordinator who happens to be moving through this canyon today. He has something from Kingfisher, something left over from what was never finished." Briggs looked at Shelton. "Has something like what?" Shelton opened her mouth. 2 seconds passed. The particular kind of 2 seconds that contained a decision rather than a search for words. She looked at Corwin, and Corwin had already turned away from the map entirely, was already pulling her equipment from the thing, already running the mental sequence of preparations that a 2,240-meter shot in 17-knot crosswind from a decommissioned tower required. Her face had closed back into the controlled focus of someone for whom the immediate task was the only task. She was not going to wait for the answer. She did not need it to do what she came here to do. Shelton looked at Briggs, and in that look he understood three things at once. That she knew the answer to his question. That the answer was large enough to change the shape of everything that had happened in this room today. And that she had decided, for reasons he could not yet see, that this was not the moment to give it to him. He filed all three things alongside the word owed. He was getting quite a collection, and he was beginning to understand that before this day ended, he was going to have to open every one of them. He looked at the woman pulling a precision rifle system from a canvas bag with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose hands had performed this sequence thousands of times, breaking down the components, checking each one with a touch that was diagnostic and certain and entirely unconscious. The way a musician handled an instrument they had played long enough that the check was no longer a check, but a greeting. He looked at the clock. 20 minutes. He pulled on his cold weather gear. When Sarah Corwin walked toward the door that led to the Western Observation Tower, Briggs did not stop her. He did not ask another question. He simply picked up the sensor relay unit from the communications table, checked the radio on his vest, and followed her out into the cold. She noticed. She did not say anything about it. She did not look back to confirm he was there. But something in the set of her shoulders changed slightly. A small, almost imperceptible release of something that had been held against contingency. She had been operating alone in this compound for however long she had been waiting out in the wind. Now she was not. He did not examine too carefully what it meant that he had made that choice. He was a man who had blocked her at a door 40 minutes ago because she did not have the right badge. He was walking out into a February mountain night behind her now, because in those 40 minutes he had seen enough to know that the designation on the badge was the least significant thing about her. He was walking out because when a person carried 19 months of something the way she carried it, in the stillness of their hands, in the precision of their language, in the complete absence of any request for permission or validation, the least a man could do was be present. The wind met them at the threshold, cold and immediate and entirely indifferent. The Western Observation Tower rose against the flat gray sky, 40 feet of steel frame and empty platform, decommissioned and dormant and about to matter in ways its original builders had not anticipated. Corwin looked up at it, not with hesitation, with the focused calculation of someone taking the final measure of a thing they were about to commit to completely. Then she looked at the sky, at the angle of the fading light, at the ridge to the northwest where the wind was forming before it descended into the canyon. Her left hand opened slightly at her side, fingers spreading apart, feeling the pressure, the direction, the particular texture of the air at this altitude and this temperature at this moment. Not with instruments, with skin. Briggs watched her do it, and something settled in him that had been unsettled since the radio called the name Wraith One into a room that had no one to claim it. Whatever she was carrying from 19 months ago, whatever the weight was, whatever the damage, whatever the long and private work of rebuilding had cost, her hands were steady. Her rate of the wind was already more precise than his sensor array. She started toward the base of the tower. He followed. The clock was running. The mountain was watching. And behind them, through the lit window of the TOC, Captain Nora Shelton stood alone at the terrain display. She was looking at the point on the map where Corwin's finger had stopped. Crawford 7, the 8,400-foot ridgeline, 4 kilometers to the northeast, north-facing, concealed. She looked at it for a long time with an expression that Briggs, had he seen it, would have recognized as something beyond operational concern. It was the expression of a debt that had never been fully paid and was now finally coming due. She picked up the secure phone, dialed a number that was not in the base directory, waited. When the line connected, she said 4 words, quiet and certain, and then she set the phone down. The words were, "She knows about Crawford." Outside, the wind pulled at the steel frame of the observation tower. Sarah Corwin began to climb. The ladder was exactly as bad as Shelton had described, and worse than Corwin had expected. Not structurally. The welds held. The frame was solid under her weight, 8 months of disuse having done nothing to the steel itself. What 8 months had done was to the surface. The rungs had developed a layer of frost that was not the thick, visible frost of a hard freeze, but the thin, almost invisible kind that formed when temperature dropped below a certain threshold and the metal surface became indistinguishable from the air around it. The kind that looked like nothing until your gloved hand found it and the grip that should have been there wasn't. She had learned about this specific kind of frost in a training exercise 12 years ago, in a different mountain range, on a different ladder, with an instructor who had told her that the most dangerous conditions were not the ones that announced themselves. The ones that announced themselves you prepared for. The ones that looked like nothing. Those were the ones that killed you. She gripped the rungs with deliberate pressure, testing each one before committing weight. Not fast, not slow. The rhythm of someone who understood that speed and safety were not the same thing and had stopped confusing them a long time ago. At rung 8, she paused. Not because of the ladder, because of what she could feel through the soles of her boots. A vibration in the frame. Faint, rhythmic, coming not from the wind, which was random and non-repeating, but from somewhere specific. She pressed her palm flat against the upright and counted. 3 seconds. 4. There it was again. The resonance of metal that had been recently stressed and was still settling, the way metal settled after weight had been on it and removed from it. Someone had climbed this ladder in the last 8 hours. She did not stop. She filed it the way Briggs filed things, with the certainty that she would return to it, and she kept climbing. At 20 feet, the wind became something different. Below 20 feet, it was a presence, uncomfortable and demanding. Above 20 feet, it became a force with a direction and a logic of its own. And once you understood the logic, you could work with it rather than against it. She had always found this to be true about wind at altitude. It was not hostile. It was simply itself, completely and without apology. And the people who fought against that got tired and made mistakes, while the people who learned to read it correctly found that it gave them information no instrument could match. At the top of the tower, she stepped onto the observation platform and did not immediately unsling her bag. She stood. The wind came from the northwest at what she estimated as 14 knots, gusting to 18 in a pattern she could already feel the edges of. It had a rotational component from the ridge to the northeast, the kind of interference pattern that sensors at ground level consistently misread because they were measuring the wind's average behavior rather than its rhythm. She had told Briggs the sensor was wrong. She had been right. She had known she would be right because she had stood in a wind like this before, in this canyon, in this air, in the winter before everything changed. 19 months ago, she had stood in a different position on this same terrain. A different tower, a kilometer to the east, a different target, a different set of facts in her hands. The shot had been clean. The mechanics had been perfect. And the facts in her hands had been wrong, not because she had been careless, but because the system that was supposed to give her accurate facts had failed her in a specific and consequential way. A way she had spent 19 months understanding, in the kind of depth that required you to go all the way down to the bottom of a thing before you could come back up. She had come back up. She opened her bag and began the setup. The rifle came together the way all well-maintained equipment comes together in the hands of someone who has cared for it properly, smoothly, without resistance. Each component finding its place with the certainty of things that have been in those places thousands of times before. She adjusted the scope for the altitude and the ambient light, which was fading now toward the flat gray of early mountain evening. She calculated the range to the far edge of the rock shelf, 2,240 meters. Slightly less than the original estimate because her angle from this position was marginally more favorable than the terrain map had shown. Terrain maps always lost something in the translation from 3 dimensions to 2. Below her, Briggs's voice came through the earpiece. Steady, controlled. The voice of a man doing the poem he had committed to doing. Sensor array reading 14 knots from the northwest, gusting pattern at 42-second intervals. The interval is closer to 36, she said. The sensor is picking up the average, not the rhythm. There's a thermal interference from the canyon floor that adds 6 seconds of apparent lag. Trust my count, not the array. A pause. The kind of pause in which a man decided whether to believe something he could not personally verify. Adjusting, he said. She had not asked for his belief. She had given him the accurate information, and he had chosen to accept it. That was the correct relationship between accurate information and the person receiving it, and it was rarer than it should have been. On the monitor feed in the TOC, she could picture it from memory, from Shelton's briefing, from her own study of the terrain. Marcus Veld was moving through the final section of Coldwater Canyon. The canyon was narrowing his options. The rock shelf at the western exit was not a trap. He had not been herded there. He was moving there because it was the most direct route to wherever he was going next. And the most direct route was what a man used when he believed himself unobserved. She checked the calculation one final time. Wind, working from her own count. Distance, 2,240 confirmed. Temperature, 19 below Celsius, which affected the round's behavior in a predictable and accountable way. Altitude 4,200 feet at her position, which compressed the air density calculation in a direction she had already incorporated. The light was going, but the scope handled the transition well. She had shot in worse light, at greater range, in worse wind. She had shot in worse everything. The question had never been whether she could make the shot. Briggs's voice again. Target approaching the shelf. Estimated 3 minutes to entry position. Copy. She settled into prone position on the platform, ignoring the cold of the steel against her body, ignoring the wind's steady lateral pressure on her right side, ignoring the way the temperature was working on the exposed skin of her wrists and the back of her neck. These were conditions. They were the environment. She had chosen to be in this environment, and she had prepared for it, and it was simply what was present. Not a problem to be solved, but a set of facts to be incorporated. She breathed. In through the nose, long and even. Out through the mouth, slower. The world through the scope narrowed to a specific rectangle of stone and open air at 2,240 meters. And everything outside that rectangle became secondary. Not ignored, registered and set aside. The difference mattered. The voice in her ear, 90 seconds. She counted the wind. 36 seconds, then a 3-second drop below the mean, then back. 36 drop, recover. The rhythm was consistent. It would stay consistent for another 15 minutes before the thermal pattern from the canyon shifted as the temperature dropped further. She had 15 minutes and she needed one. Marcus Veld appeared at the western lip of the canyon at 2 minutes and 47 seconds. She saw him through the scope as a small, distinct shape against the gray granite, moving, then decelerating, then stopping. He stopped at a specific point on the rock shelf, not at the edge, not in the middle, but at a point approximately 8 meters from the canyon wall, a point that offered a clear view in 3 directions and put solid rock behind him. The position of a man with field awareness, a man who knew how to stand in open terrain without being completely exposed. He was not a fighter, but he had spent enough time around fighters to have absorbed some of their habits. He stopped, looked east, back into the canyon. Then he looked north toward the ridge. Then, and Corwin registered this with the complete attention her training required, he turned and looked west, toward the tower, toward her, not at her. She was certain of that. At 2,240 meters in the fading light, with proper concealment, he could not have seen her. But he turned his face toward the tower with an expression. Even at that distance, through the quality of how a body holds itself, she could read the general shape of an expression. That was not the expression of someone scanning the horizon. It was the expression of someone who knew approximately where a thing was and was looking toward where they knew it to be. Her finger was on the trigger. He did not move. He had turned toward the tower, and he had stopped moving, and he was standing in the posture of someone who had made a decision about where they were going to be and had arrived there and was now simply present. Not resigned, not panicked. Present in the specific way that people were present when they understood what was happening and had accepted what. She exhaled half a breath, counted the wind. 32 seconds, 33, 34. The drop at 36, the brief window of reduced lateral pressure she needed. 36. She held the remainder of her breath. The trigger broke. The sound was massive and immediate, and then the wind took it. She stayed on the scope, did not move, watched. 1, 2, 3, 4. At the far end of the rock shelf, Marcus Veld went down. Not in the staggering way of a man hit by something he didn't expect. Down in the complete way. The way a structure went down when its central support was removed cleanly and entirely. There and then not there. 1 second he was a man standing on a shelf of granite in the failing afternoon light, and the next second he was not. The shelf was empty. She held position. 10 seconds. 12. The wind rebuilt toward its next gust. The gray stone of the shelf was completely still. Briggs on the radio. His voice had changed, not broken, not unprofessional, but altered in the way a voice altered when a man had witnessed something that had changed his reference point. Ridgeline Actual, this is FOB Kellner, requesting confirmation on target status. Acknowledge. The reply from the Phantom Element drone team. FOB Kellner, target neutralized. Confirm visual, Alpha 7 down. A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Then, confirm primary shooter's position. Briggs. Primary shooter is on the western tower. And then, after a pause that she could feel even through the earpiece, through the cold air, through the 40 feet of steel between them, she's still there. She let herself take one full breath. Not a breath of relief. The shot had always been makeable. She had never doubted the shot. A breath of return. The world expanding back from the narrow rectangle of the scope to the full wide cold of the mountain in winter. The wind resuming its presence against her right side. the temperature registering again against the exposed skin of her neck. She began breaking down the rifle. She was on the second component when Shelton's voice cut into the radio channel. Not through the standard net, through the command frequency. The frequency that required deliberate choice to access. Briggs. The word was clipped and carried an urgency underneath it that Shelton's voice did not usually carry. Shelton was a person who kept her urgency interior, who showed you only what was useful for you to see. When the urgency came through, it meant the urgency had become too large to contain. I need eyes on the drone footage of the final approach. Before the shot. I need it now. Briggs, steady. What am I looking for? Alpha 7's posture, specifically his head position in the 90 seconds before the shot. A pause. Briggs reviewing the footage on the TOC monitor. A longer pause. Then, he turned west, toward the tower. At what point in the approach? Approximately 2 minutes before the shot, he slowed his approach at the same time. The silence on the channel was a specific kind of silence. The silence in which someone was processing something they already suspected and finding that the data confirmed it. He knew the position, Shelton said. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a conclusion being reached. Corwin, still on the platform, rifle components laid out in the methodical order of breakdown, said, I know, I saw him look at the tower. Another silence. Briggs, you saw that and you didn't report it? I reported the shot. I needed to confirm the outcome before I told you there may be a second variable. She fit the last component into the bag, sealed it. Alpha 7 knew approximately where I was. He chose not to move. He stood in position and let me take the shot. The silence this time lasted 5 full seconds. Shelton's voice, very quiet now, very controlled in the specific way things got controlled when they were on the edge of something large. Alpha 7 wanted to be found. Corwin descended the ladder the way she had ascended it. Careful, deliberate, testing each rung, not faster despite the cold, not faster despite the need to be back inside, because speed on a frost-covered ladder was how you ended up on the ground with a fractured clavicle instead of in the TOC, with the information that was forming in her mind, with the gathering certainty of something she had been circling toward without fully knowing it. Briggs was at the base. He had been there through the entire shot, through the confirmation, through the radio exchange on the platform. He had stood in the cold and done his job and not added anything unnecessary to the air. She stepped off the bottom rung and looked at him. The drone, she said. Do you have close-in footage of Veld's hands and wrists in the final 60 seconds before the shot? He already had the handheld unit out. He had anticipated the question, or something close to it. He pulled the footage and handed her the unit. She watched. 40 seconds of enhanced drone footage, close enough to read body language at 2,240 meters. Veld's posture on the shelf, the way he turned toward the tower, the way his hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, not at his chest, and on his left wrist, just visible below the sleeve of his jacket, something that the drone's resolution was exactly sufficient to show, a mark. Recent, dark ink against pale winter skin. What is that? Briggs asked. He was looking over her shoulder. He had seen it too. It's a tattoo, she said. It's new. The ink hasn't fully settled. She expanded the image with 2 fingers, bringing the wrist into the clearest possible focus. The mark resolved into something legible. Not a design, numbers, a grid. Those are coordinates. The mountain wind moved between them. He marked himself, Briggs said. He marked himself, she confirmed. Before he came through this canyon, he knew he wasn't coming back out. He wanted whoever found him to find what he was carrying. She handed the unit back to Briggs. Their eyes met in the cold and fading light, and she could see him doing the same calculation she had already done, running the logic forward from the fact of a man who had walked into a kill zone knowing it was a kill zone, who had turned his face toward the shooter's position, not in fear but in confirmation, who had stood his ground and looked at death coming and chosen to receive it because the information he carried needed to be delivered, and this was the only delivery method he had available. He was a courier, Briggs said, not a target. He was both. She picked up her bag. He was a target who chose to become a courier. The coordinates on his wrist. That's what he was carrying. That's what Shelton hasn't told us about yet. They went back inside. The TOC had a different quality than it had 20 minutes ago. Not louder, not more active. The opposite, in fact, quieter. The analyst working with a focused intensity that was distinct from the controlled stress of the pre-shot atmosphere. The decompression that followed operational success, yes. But underneath it, the particular quality of attention that emerged when a room understood that the mission it had just completed was not the mission they had thought it was. Shelton was at the terrain display. She was not looking at Coldwater Canyon. She was looking at Crawford 7. Corwin set her bag near the door, crossed the room, stood beside Shelton and looked at the same point on the map. She did not say anything. She waited because Shelton was going to tell her now. Whatever had been held back was going to come forward because the drone footage of a man standing at coordinates he had written on his own wrist in a place he had chosen to die made the holding back untenable. Some information could be classified only until the moment when the event it pertained to made the classification itself into a kind of lie, and that moment had now arrived. Briggs came in behind them. He did not pull Shelton aside. He stood where he was. He had earned the full conversation, and he knew it, and so did Shelton. Shelton pulled up a secondary file on the terrain display. Not a tactical overlay. A case file, classified, open now on the authority of the S2 who had classified it. She opened it without ceremony, without preamble, without any of the diplomatic framing that people sometimes use when they were delivering information that should have been delivered earlier. She opened it and let it speak. Operation Kingfisher, she said. Her voice was steady in the way that required effort to keep steady. 19 months ago, the insertion team that Sarah overwatched, 3 members. They went in on the eastern approach to the Crawford Ridgeline. The extraction point was a secondary LZ 4 kilometers south. They never reached the LZ. Briggs, MIA. Officially, yes. Shelton moved a graphic on the display, a thermal map overlaid on the Crawford 7 ridgeline. 3 heat signatures. Faint, filtered through rock and insulation, but persistent. Consistent with human presence at a fixed location maintained over a long period. We first picked up these signatures 6 weeks ago, passive scan during a routine sensor sweep of the northern quadrant. We did not attribute them to the Kingfisher team until 10 days ago, when cross-referencing behavioral intelligence from a separate source confirmed that Ridge Compact has been maintaining an off-grid holding site in the Crawford area since the winter before last. The room had gone to a particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of shock. Trained personnel in operational settings did not go to shock. They went to processing. The rapid internal recalibration of everything they thought they knew to incorporate the new fact. But underneath the processing, in the place where professional discipline had not yet fully reached, there was something else. The weight of what 3 of those thermal signatures meant. What 19 months in a holding site at 8,400 feet in the San Gabriel backcountry meant for the people inside it. 3 of our people, Briggs said. He said it the way he would have said any operational fact, with the flatness that the job required. But he said it, and the saying of it was its own kind of acknowledgement. 3 of our people, alive based on the thermal signature pattern, alive and stationary, which in this context means held by force, not by choice. Shelton moved to the next section of the file. The holding site is maintained by a Ridge Compact logistics cell, food, fuel, basic medical supplies, rotated in on an 8 to 10 day cycle. Marcus Veld was the coordinator of that rotation. He arranged the deliveries. He managed the personnel. He was the operational reason those 3 signatures have remained stable for 19 months. She paused. Let the implications sit for the 2 seconds it needed to resolve itself. With Veld gone, Corwin said. With Veld gone, the next scheduled delivery cycle is disrupted. The last delivery was 13 days ago. The next one was planned for 11 days from today. That cycle does not happen automatically. It required Veld's coordination. The cell members who execute the physical delivery do not initiate it independently. They wait for his instruction. Without his instruction, the cycle does not complete. 24 days between deliveries, Briggs said. 13 days since the last one. 11 days until the next one, which now won't happen. The signatures on the thermal are stable now. They will not stay stable indefinitely if the supply cycle collapses. This was the arithmetic that Corwin had already run in her head on the ladder, on the platform, in the 40 seconds before Briggs had said her name and she had started coming down. She had not run it to produce a feeling. She had run it to understand the situation accurately, which was the only form of understanding that was useful to her. The situation was this. 3 American service members had been alive and stationary on a Crawford Ridgeline for 19 months, and the only person who had known the door to their location had walked into a kill zone and written the coordinates on his wrist so that someone would find them. And now there were 11 days before the supply disruption became something more serious than disruption. 11 days was a clock. She was familiar with clocks. The coordinates on his wrist, Briggs said. He had pulled up the drone footage image on the secondary monitor, the expanded view of Veld's left wrist, the fresh ink resolving into numbers. Grid reference. Precise. The work of a man who had understood that the information he was delivering needed to survive the delivery and that the best container for it was his own body. 43 degrees, 51 minutes, 22 seconds north, 117 degrees, 12 minutes, 14 seconds west. Shelton overlaid the coordinates on the terrain map. The point landed on the Crawford Ridge line, 40 meters east of the cluster of thermal signatures. An approach corridor, an access point, a door, as Briggs had said. The door that Veld had known and had chosen to give away because the alternative was taking the knowledge with him. He was giving us the door, Briggs said. He knew he was a logistics coordinator who was about to be eliminated, Corwin said. He knew the network would not survive his absence. He may have known we were building towards this for weeks. He had time to prepare. She looked at the coordinates on the map. He could have gone to ground. He could have changed his route, avoided the canyon, and bought himself additional time. He chose not to. He walked through the canyon and he turned his face toward the tower, and he stood in place because he had made a decision about what mattered most. The silence that followed this was different from the operational silences of the past hour. It was the silence of people who were thinking about a man none of them had known, a man who had spent years facilitating the imprisonment of American service members and had arrived, at some point in the months preceding today, at a reckoning that had changed his calculation of what he was willing to do. Briggs pulled Shelton aside, not far, not outside of Corwin's earshot, because the days of pulling things out of Corwin's earshot were finished as of approximately 40 minutes ago when the radio called a name, and she answered it from outside a closed door. He pulled Shelton to the edge of the room and he kept his voice low, not for secrecy, but for the simple reason that some conversations deserved a boundary around them, even when they couldn't be private. "How long have you known?" he said. Shelton looked at him directly. This was a quality Briggs had noted about her from their first weeks working together. She did not look away when the hard question arrived. She met it with the full weight of her attention, and she answered it honestly, which was not the same as answering it completely, but it was the best that could be offered in the time available. 6 weeks, I've had the thermal signatures. 10 days, I've had the attribution. 8 months ago, I brought Sarah in under the advisory designation because I needed someone with direct knowledge of the Kingfisher insertion corridor who could operate at the precision level this recovery is going to require. You could have told her what it was for, he said. 8 months ago, the first day she arrived. I could have. Shelton's voice had in it the specific texture of a person who had made a judgment call they believed was correct and was neither defensive about it nor fully at peace with it. The honest middle ground of consequential decisions. I needed to know she was ready, not her assessment of her own readiness, not a report from Phantom Element about her current status. Her, in real conditions, at real range, under real pressure. I needed to see the shot before I gave her the mission the shot was preparation for. You used the mission as an audition. I used the mission as confirmation. She looked at him steadily. There is a difference. One treats a person as a means. The other treats a person as a capability that you have a responsibility to verify before you ask them to stake 3 other lives on it. Briggs thought about whether there was a difference. He had the beginning of a response forming when the analyst at the perimeter console interrupted everything. Briggs, level voice, the specific level of someone who had checked the data twice. Eastern sensor array, thermal signature, stationary. He was at the console in 4 steps. The display showed the eastern perimeter, the slope that ran down toward the valley floor, 170 meters outside the compound wall, on a ridgeback that offered a diagonal sightline across FOB Kellner's main activity corridor. The signature was there, prone, still. The specific stillness of a thermal signature that had been in the same position long enough to have fully settled. This was not a person who had just arrived. This was a person who had been there. Shelton was at the console beside him. She looked at the data for 3 seconds. Sniper position. Not a question. How long? Briggs asked the analyst. Array logged the signature 23 minutes ago. But the resolution pattern suggests thermal equilibrium with the ground, which means at least 45 minutes of contact, possibly longer. 45 minutes. The signature had been there before the shot, before Corwin went up the western tower. Someone had positioned on the eastern slope while the entire focus of FOB Kellner was on the western canyon. Briggs looked at the distance calculation the array was running. 2,580 meters. He turned to find Corwin already at the console behind him. She had not been called over. She had heard the exchange and arrived on her own terms, and she was looking at the signature data with the same focused attention she had turned on every piece of terrain she had encountered since walking through the TOC door. Elevated position, she said. Uphill from us, which works against the shooter. The round will arrive with less retained energy, but the diagonal sightline puts them at a favorable angle to the main entrance and the vehicle staging area. She traced the sightline on the overlay with her finger. They're not aimed at the TOC. They're aimed at the activity corridor. Personnel, Briggs said. Personnel, she confirmed. Threat assessment? This from Shelton behind them. Corwin looked at the signature. The stillness of it, the patience of it, the very specific quality of a thermal signature that had not moved in 45 minutes despite the cold, despite the wind, despite everything the mountain winter was doing to the ground it was lying on. They're settled. The thermal equilibrium confirms it. They've been in position long enough that their body heat has transferred to the ground around them. That's the signature of trained patience, not opportunism. Phantom element? Briggs asked. He kept his voice flat. Shelton's face did something that Briggs noted carefully. It was not quite surprise. It was the expression of someone for whom a possibility had just moved from the back of their calculations to the front. It's possible, she said. Not phantom element, Corwin said. Both of them looked at her. She was still studying the thermal display. The positioning is too exposed for an observation element. Phantom element doesn't put a watcher at 2,580 meters in a prone position that becomes visible to a thermal array within an hour of establishment. If phantom element wanted to observe this operation, they would observe it from the drone feed they already have. She paused. This is someone who wanted us to find them. The same word she had used about Veld. Briggs looked at the distance calculation again. 2,580 meters. Uphill. Temperature now 22 below. The light was fully gone now. What was on the sensor display was thermal, not optical. A thermal target at 2,580 meters uphill in the dark was a different problem from a thermal target at 2,240 meters in the fading afternoon. He looked at Corwin. She was already calculating. He could see it happening in real time. The slight movement of her eyes that was not looking at anything in the room but was following the internal progression of numbers. Distance, elevation differential, temperature gradient, wind shift. The complete arithmetic of a shot that the base's best qualified shooter had just completed at 2,240 meters 18 minutes ago and was now being asked to run at 2,580 meters in the dark. Can you make this shot? He asked. He said it directly. Not because he doubted her, but because she was the only person whose answer mattered, and because she deserved to be asked directly rather than assumed into a decision. She looked at him. Those gray eyes that had given him nothing at the door 40 minutes ago had something in them now. Not warmth, not exactly. Something that was the product of 40 minutes of working alongside someone who had chosen to stand at the base of a cold tower in the dark rather than sit in a warm tuck watching a feed. I never stopped being able to make this shot, she said. I stopped making it. Those are different things. How much time before they fire? The analyst at the perimeter console. Signature shifted 2 degrees in the last 90 seconds, consistent with final acquisition. Final acquisition, the last positional adjustment before a shooter committed to a target. Minutes, Corwin said, maybe less. She had her bag in her hand, the bag she had just repacked and after the first shot. She was already doing the mental pre-work that preceded climbing to a firing position, the internal checks, the adjustment of everything she was carrying toward what the next 17 minutes would require. Briggs held the door. He thought, in the 2 seconds it took to hold a door open, about the conversation that had happened 40 minutes ago in the corner of this room, about what she had told him about Kingfisher, about rebuilding, about the weight being where the weight should be. He thought about the shot she had just made at 2,240 meters in a crosswind after 19 months of standing down, and about the absolute stillness of her hands when she came off the ladder. He did not think for long. Some things did not require extended deliberation. Some things you simply did, and when you were asked later why you had done them, the answer was the kind of answer that could not be fully articulated because it resided in the part of a person that was older than language. He held the door. They went out into the dark. The north perimeter wall was 4 meters of poured concrete, reinforced, with an observation post at the top that had been maintained for guard rotation and was empty now in the gap between shifts. The access was a steel-rung ascent on the interface, better maintained than the western tower because this position was used regularly. The rungs cold but grippable. The platform at the top sandbag reinforced and oriented northeast. She went up fast, faster than she had gone up the western tower, because this surface she could trust and because the clock was different now. Not the mission clock on a wall inside. The clock of a trained person in a prone position 2 kilometers northeast who had shifted 2 degrees toward final acquisition. Every second she spent on the ascent was a second that the thermal signature on the eastern slope was settling toward a decision that, once made, could not be unmade. The observation post at the top of the north wall was a working position, not a decommissioned one. Sandbags, solid, orientation correct. Washed. Field of view to the northeast, to Crawford, to the eastern slope where the sensor array had found something that had been lying in the frozen ground long enough to leave a thermal impression in the earth around it. She did not pause at the top the way she had paused at the top of the tower. She moved directly into position, directly into the work. At the top of the wall, the wind was not the same animal as the wind at the top of the tower. The tower had given her altitude and full exposure, the wind arriving from open sky. The wall gave her a channel effect, compressed air moving through the space between the compound wall and the ridge to the north, accelerating as it came through, unpredictable in its specific direction in a way that tower wind was not. Channel wind was faster and less honest. It told you one thing at one moment and something different 4 seconds later. And the difference between those two things could mean everything at 2,580 meters. She spent 40 seconds doing nothing but standing in it, not standing still in the passive way of someone waiting for the wind to declare itself. Standing in the active way of someone using their body as an instrument, left hand open at her side, palm facing the northeast, feeling the pressure differential between the gusts, cheekbones registering the temperature and direction. The exposed skin at the base of her neck, reading the wind's lower register, the part of it that the gusts masked, but that the steady, sustained component always present underneath gave away if you were quiet enough to hear it. Below the wall, Briggs relayed data in short transmissions. Wind reading from the array, the thermal signature's last log position, the degree shift that the analyst had flagged. He relayed it in the clipped economy of a man who had understood what she needed from him without being told, which was information at the right interval and silence in between. Not reassurance, not commentary, not the management of her experience. Data, clean and accurate, and then space for her to do the work. She set up, the scope adjusted, the calculations ran. Distance, 2,580 meters, confirmed from the sensor array, consistent with her own estimate from the terrain geometry. Elevation differential, her position approximately 12 meters above the target, which compressed the drop calculation and required a downward correction to the point of aim. Temperature 22 below, dropping. Air density at this altitude affecting the round's drag profile across the full distance of flight. Wind from the north-northeast in the compressed channel. Mean velocity 14 knots but variable in the channel effect, rising to 17 at irregular intervals that she needed to count and account for. She was counting. The thermal signature through the scope was not a person in any detailed visual sense. At 2,580 meters in the dark with a thermal optic, it was a pattern of warmth against cold, a specific distribution of heat that corresponded to a human body in a prone position, settled, with the warmth pooling slightly beneath the torso where extended ground contact had transferred heat into the frozen earth. The signature of someone who had been lying there long enough to have become part of the landscape in one very specific way. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about it the way she had trained herself to think about it, fully and without flinching. Because flinching was not the same as having the correct response, and the correct response required seeing clearly. A trained person in a prone position aimed at the activity corridor of FOB Kellner, a person who had established that position before the first shot, a person whose signature had shifted 2 degrees toward final acquisition, while 17 trained personnel moved through the compound below. She felt the weight of it fully. That was how it was supposed to be. The weight was how you knew you understood what you were doing, and she understood exactly what she was doing, and she did not want to be without it. But there was something else present too, something she had noticed in the data that Briggs had relayed. The signature shift was toward Crawford, not toward the compound entrance. The rifle's orientation, as best as the drone's thermal could determine, was not pointed at the vehicle corridor or the personnel routes. It was pointed northeast, toward the ridge, toward the access corridor that Veld's coordinates had identified. Whoever was out there was covering Crawford 7, not targeting the base. She held this information alongside everything else, did not act on it prematurely, did not let it produce a hesitation that could cost her the window. But she held it, and when the wind's channel rhythm brought her the moment she needed, the 2-second drop in the compression cycle, the brief honesty of still air, she made the decision that the information required. Not center mass, shoulder, incapacitate, remove the capability without removing the person who might be able to tell her in the next hour exactly why they had been covering Crawford Ridge in the dark with a rifle they had not fired. She exhaled. The trigger broke. The sound was contained differently here, close against the wall, the report bouncing back from the concrete rather than being taken immediately by open air. Then it dispersed. Then there was only the wind in the channel and the cold in the 40 feet of dark between her position and the ground where Briggs was standing. She stayed on the scope. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The thermal signature at 2,580 meters moved. Not the way Veld had moved. Veld had gone down in the complete, structured way of a thing that had lost its central support. This signature moved laterally, a rapid displacement to the left, 3 meters, then stillness. The kind of movement that belonged to a body responding to impact at the extremity, not the center. The kind of movement that said, hit, but not center mass. She kept the scope on it. The signature was still, changed in its distribution. The warmth pattern altered, pooled differently. The signature of a person who was horizontal but not in the same configuration as before. Hit and down. The lateral motion, consistent with a grazing wound, a shoulder or upper arm, enough to take a person off a rifle and onto the ground without killing them. The drone feed, repositioned since the first shot, came back almost immediately. FOB Kellner, secondary threat on eastern slope. Target down. Repeat. Target down. Assessing. A pause. Target is alive. Disarmed by impact. Requesting disposition instructions. The channel was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Briggs below the wall. Hold position. We're coming to you. Corwin kept the scope on the signature. Alive. She had shot to incapacitate, and the incapacitation had been precise. And the person 2,580 meters away in the dark on the eastern slope of a California mountain range in February was alive because she had understood exactly what she was doing and had done exactly that and nothing more. She held that fact, did not perform it, did not distance herself from it, held it as a person held a thing that required acknowledgement rather than management. She began breaking down the rifle. Briggs's voice came through the earpiece, and it was different from all the previous times it had come through the earpiece, not because it was louder or softer or carried a different emotional register, because it was saying her name. Sarah, a pause that had the texture of something considered. Come down when you're ready. Not a command, not a timeline. When you're ready. She fit the last component into the bag and sealed it. Looked out once across the dark compound, the lit windows of the TOC and the medical bay and the vehicle maintenance shed, the ordinary human light of a forward operating base in winter. The mountain beyond the wall was invisible in the dark, but she could feel it. The way you always felt, high terrain after dark, not as a threat but as a fact. Something very large and very old that would still be there long after the base was gone and the mission was complete and the people who had stood on it had moved on to whatever came next. She descended the wall. Briggs was at the bottom. He had been running, not to the wall but somewhere, and he had come back. And the effort of it was still in his breathing. And he had the sensor unit in his left hand and his right hand was open at his side. She stepped off the last rung, looked at him. The drone ID'd the shooter on the eastern slope, he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness that she had not heard in it before. Something that was working to stay inside the professional register and was not entirely succeeding. The rifle, the gear, the positioning methodology. He stopped, started again. It's Hayes. The cold between them was complete and specific. Hayes is in the medical bay, she said. Hayes was in the medical bay. He was last logged there at 2200 last night. Briggs looked at the sensor unit in his hand as if it might offer a different answer than the one it had already given him. It did not. His fractured clavicle is real. His right shoulder is fully functional. He was cleared for limited duty by the medical officer at 0630 this morning and apparently decided that limited duty was a flexible concept that included establishing a prone firing position at 2,580 meters on a frozen eastern slope in the dark. She looked toward the eastern slope, toward the perimeter wall, and the dark beyond it, toward the place where a man with a functional right shoulder had lain in the frozen ground for at least 45 minutes, with a rifle pointed not at the compound's personnel, but at the approach corridor to Crawford Ridge. He was covering the door, she said, not watching us, covering the coordinates. Briggs looked at her. She could see him running the same calculations she had already run, arriving at the same place. He knew about Crawford, Briggs said. Yes, which means someone told him before today. Someone who knew about the thermal signatures, about the holding site, about the fact that an extraction was eventually going to be necessary. She paused. Someone who brought him into the operational picture, even though he was formally on medical hold and outside the standard need-to-know chain. Briggs said nothing. He was looking at the ground between them in the specific way of a man whose understanding of the day's events was being restructured backward from this moment to the beginning. The vehicle accident 2 days ago. Hayes in the medical bay. A primary shooter conveniently unavailable at the same moment that an advisory coordinator with a redacted file appeared at the south gate. Shelton, he said. That would be my first question, Corwin said. Second is whether Hayes acted voluntarily on the injury. The accident, the fractured clavicle that preserves full function of the shooting shoulder. She looked at him steadily. Self-staged, calculated impact. He would have had to model the collision parameters precisely to fracture the bone without damaging the joint. Briggs was quiet for a moment that was longer than the cold justified. You think he did the math on how to hurt himself correctly? I think Danny Hayes has been part of this recovery operation in some capacity for longer than any of us has been told. And I think one of the three signatures on Crawford 7 is someone he's served with, and that changes the arithmetic of what a person is willing to do. She picked up her bag. Let's go find out, she said. They walked back toward the light. The TOC door opened into warmth and the steady hum of equipment, and the smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner long enough to become something almost caustic, but still, in the specific context of a February mountain night, welcome. Shelton was at the terrain display. She turned when they entered, and her face in the moment before she controlled it showed the expression of someone who had been doing their own calculations and had arrived at the same conclusions they were carrying. She looked at Corwin first. He's going to be all right, she said. The shot was exactly what it needed to be. Corwin set her bag down near the door, said nothing. He asked me to put him on the slope, Shelton said. 6 weeks ago, when I first attributed the thermal signatures to the Kingfisher team, he came to me the same day. He had served alongside one of the 3 people on that ridge, 4 years together. He told me he needed to be part of whatever brought them home. She paused. I told him we needed a reason for him to stay on base when the operation moved into its active phase. He told me he could arrange that. The vehicle accident, Briggs said. He came to me with the proposal first, Shelton said. I told him I could not authorize it. He said he didn't need me to authorize it. He needed me to not stop it. And I made the decision not to stop it because what he was proposing to do had one purpose, which was to cover a door that needed to be covered. And I had authorized his involvement in the operation through Phantom Element before he staged the accident. She looked at Briggs directly. The Phantom Element authorization is on file. It predates the accident by 4 days. What Hayes did to himself was his own calculation, but he was not acting outside a sanctioned operation. He was an active element who chose his own method of maintaining your cover. She paused. Those are the facts as they stand, and they will be reported as such in the after action. Briggs looked at her, looked at the terrain display, looked at the specific way a fact could have the same edges as the one you thought you had and still be a different shape entirely when you finally held it in full light. He was never outside the operation, he said. It was not a question. It was the specific sound of a man incorporating a corrected picture. He was the operation's second axis, Shelton said, positioned to cover the approach corridor while the primary engagement was handled in the canyon. She moved back to the terrain display. His fracture is real. His right shoulder is fully functional. He will be operational again in 36 hours. The mountain wind came against the TOC walls, found its gaps, entered, moved at floor level through the room. The monitors cycled. On the terrain display, the Crawford 7 thermal signatures persisted. 3 small points of warmth, faint and steady and patient in the way that only people could be patient, with the specific human quality of choosing, each day, to continue. Corwin looked at them, looked at the coordinates overlaid on the ridgeline, the door that Veld had written in his own flesh and delivered at the cost of his life. The door that Hayes had spent 45 minutes in the frozen dark covering from the outside. 11 days, she said. Possibly less, Shelton said. Once the cell realizes Veld is gone, their timeline becomes unpredictable. They may accelerate the supply cycle. They may abandon the site entirely if they feel the operation is compromised. She moved the overlay on the display, bringing the approach corridor into sharper resolution. We need to move before they make that calculation. Corwin looked at the door, 40 meters east of the thermal signatures. An access point through terrain she had studied from the other side 19 months ago, when she had been overwatching an insertion team that had gone in and not come back out. The weight of what she carried was present and correct. The doubt was not in her hands and not in her eye and not in the moment of decision. She had spent 19 months arriving at this. She was ready. She had been ready for 8 months. Then we should start the extraction planning tonight, she said, while the window is still open and the coordinates are fresh. Briggs looked at the display, looked at Shelton, looked at the woman who had walked through his door, through the door he had blocked, in the cold, in the wind, in the diminishing afternoon light, less than 3 hours ago. Yes, he said, tonight. Outside, the February dark pressed against the TOC windows. Patient, complete. On the eastern slope, the medical team was moving through that dark toward Danny Hayes, toward the patch of ground where a man had chosen to lie for 45 minutes in the cold because one of the signatures on a thermal display was a person he had served with and was not willing to stop serving. And on the Crawford Ridgeline, 4 kilometers to the northeast, 3 small points of warmth held their position in the cold blue dark. Steady, faint, patient. Something was going to change. Sarah Corwin stood at the terrain display and looked at the door, and the weight she had been carrying for 19 months finally had somewhere to go. The extraction planning took 4 hours and 40 minutes, and when it was finished, the compound outside had gone completely white. Not from new snowfall. The snow that had been falling since late afternoon had simply accumulated past the threshold where individual flakes were visible and become a single continuous surface, covering the footprints in the vehicle tracks, in the 2 patches of flattened ground where medical teams had moved through the dark toward a man on an eastern slope. The compound that had existed that afternoon, the one with the access road and the mission clock and the threshold where a woman had stood in the cold holding a badge that said her name was Calloway, was now under a layer of white that did not remember it. Briggs stood at the TOC window and looked at it. He had done this at the end of significant operations before. The specific standing and looking that was not exhaustion and not reflection, but something in between. A man taking the measure of how much had changed since the last time he had looked at ordinary ground. Behind him, the TOC was still active. Shelton was on the command channel to Phantom Element, walking through the extraction framework they had built across the table in the past 4 hours. The framework was solid. Briggs had watched it develop with the attention of a man who had managed complex operations for 14 years, and he had found nothing in it to challenge. It was the work of 3 professionals, one of whom knew the terrain from the inside, one of whom had been building toward this for 6 weeks, and one of whom had spent the past 4 hours becoming willing to trust what the other 2 knew. The extraction had a timeline. First light, 48 hours out. 2 teams, Corwin and Hayes on overwatch from separate positions on the Crawford approach, covering the 2 angles that the ridgeline terrain made unavoidable for anyone moving in or out of the holding site. Phantom Element providing a primary extraction element on the ground. 4 personnel moving up the axis corridor from the coordinates that Veld had written on his wrist. Medical support staged at a secondary LZ 3 kilometers south, the same LZ that the original Kingfisher insertion team had never reached. Shelton coordinating from FOB Kellner with drone coverage on the surrounding terrain. Clean, accountable, built with the kind of precision that came from understanding not just what needed to happen, but why each step of it needed to happen in the way it was designed. When Shelton had finished the brief and the Phantom Element coordination element had signed off on the framework, the channel had gone quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than protocol required. Then the Phantom Element duty officer had said, "FOB Kellner, this is a well-constructed plan." It was not effusive. It was the kind of compliment that meant something because it was given by people who had seen bad plans fail and knew what a good one looked like. Briggs had looked at Corwin when the call ended. She was standing at the terrain display, still looking at the 3 thermal signatures on the Crawford ridgeline. She had been looking at them at various points during the entire 4 hours, not with the fixed attention of someone fixating, but with the periodic checking of someone monitoring something that mattered, making sure they were still there, making sure the 3 small points of warmth were still choosing, one moment at a time, to continue. They were still there. He left the window and crossed the room to where she was standing. The medical officer's update on Hayes, he said, 36 hours until he can take a prone firing position without risk to the clavicle. Then he has 12 hours to spare before the extraction window, she said. He'll be on the slope. I know. She looked at the display a moment longer. He needs to be. Briggs understood this. There was a version of this operation in which Hayes stayed in the medical bay and rested and recovered on the appropriate schedule and was kept well away from the active phase. There was a version in which his involvement was acknowledged as valuable in past tense and someone else covered his angle. That version was operationally sound and medically defensible and would have been the version that a certain kind of commanding officer chose without a second thought. The man who had calculated the impact parameters to fracture his own clavicle without damaging his shooting shoulder so that he could remain in position for an operation that had a person he served with at its center, was not a man who was going to accept a version of the outcome that left him in a medical bay while someone else stood on the ridge. Sarah. He said her name the way he had said it the first time at the base of the north wall in the dark. Without title, without distance, just the name said plainly, the way one person said another person's name when they had earned the right to say it that way. Before the extraction, before the 48 hours, I need to tell you something that belongs to you. She turned from the display and looked at him. He pulled a chair from the nearest workstation and sat down. Not because he was tired, though he was tired, because what he was about to say deserved a different posture than standing, and he had heard her say that once about a different conversation, and he had understood why she said it. I need to tell you what I thought when you came up the access road, he said, before I knew anything about you, before the radio, before the file. She waited. I saw a woman I didn't know arriving with no escort and a badge that meant nothing operational, and I blocked the door because that was the correct procedure. And I want you to know that the correct procedure and the right action are not always the same thing, and I have been thinking about that since approximately the moment the radio called your designation. He paused. I was looking at the badge. I wasn't looking at you. A man with 14 years in uniform should know the difference. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not wounded and not forgiving, because forgiveness was not the right category for what he was offering. The right category was something simpler. An honest account. One person telling another person what had actually happened and what it had actually cost. You didn't know enough to look at me instead of the badge, she said. That's not the same as choosing not to look. It's close enough to the same thing that I'm not comfortable with the distance between them. She looked at him for a long moment. Those gray eyes that had given him nothing in the wind at the threshold, that had given him everything he needed to know in the 40 minutes between the threshold and the tower. The system creates the distance, she said. That's a different problem than you. The system creates the distance, he agreed, and then men like me stand in it and call it procedure. She did not argue with that. She also did not let him carry it beyond what was accurate. You came out to the base of the tower, she said. You didn't have to do that. No. You stood there in the cold for 20 minutes when you could have been in a warm room watching a feed. Yes. That's not nothing, she said. That's not a small thing. Men who are only their procedures don't do that. Briggs sat with him that for a moment. Outside the TOC, the compound was white and quiet. The snow had stopped somewhere in the last 2 hours, and what was left was the still, specific silence of a mountain after snowfall, when the air had been emptied of its water and become something almost crystalline, carrying sound differently than it carried it before. In the medical bay across the compound, Danny Hayes was sleeping. The medical officer had sedated him lightly after setting the arm properly and completing the imaging, and had told Briggs that Hayes had stayed awake long enough only to ask one question. The question was not about his shoulder or his prognosis or his operational status. The question was, are they still on the ridge? Briggs had told him yes. Hayes had closed his eyes. Shelton came away from the command station and stood at the edge of the conversation, which was her way of entering one. She had the quality of a person who had been listening from a distance and was now deciding to come forward, not because she had been excluded, but because she had needed to hear the first part before she could contribute the second. There's something I've been holding since Kingfisher, she said. She looked at Corwin directly. She had looked at her directly in every significant moment of this day, and Briggs had noticed this as a quality that Shelton had worked to maintain deliberately. Not something that came naturally, but something that had been chosen and practiced and was now as close to natural as a chosen thing could get. Something that belongs to this conversation. Corwin looked at her. Then say it. In the brief for Operation Kingfisher, the brief I prepared, there was a footnote on page 7 of the target intelligence file, a source classification note. It was buried in the formatting of the document in a way that could be read as administrative rather than substantive. But it was there. It indicated that Matlin had prior agency contact. She stopped. I read it. I saw it. I did not flag it because the operational order from above the S2 level was clear, and the order was to designate Matlin hostile and brief accordingly, and I had been given that order by someone with the authority to give it, and I followed the order without asking the question the footnote required me to ask. The room was completely still, not the still of people who had stopped moving, the still of people who had arrived at the center of a thing that had been circling toward them all day and had nowhere further to go. You saw it, Corwin said. I saw it. I classified it as administrative. I didn't stop. Shelton's voice was level in the way that required a foundation beneath it. I have told myself since then that I made a judgment call under time pressure that turned out to be wrong. That is technically accurate. It is not complete. She paused. The complete version is, I saw something that should have made me stop, and I did not stop, and you paid for that, not me. Corwin was quiet for a long time. Briggs did not fill the silence. Some silences belong to two people, and the space between them, and any addition from the outside diminished rather than added. Who gave the order? Corwin said finally. Shelton opened a folder on the command workstation. A document, classification markings at the top, a signature block at the bottom. She turned the screen toward Corwin without a word. Corwin looked at it, read the name in the signature block, looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds. Then she looked away from the screen and looked at the terrain display, at the Crawford 7 signatures, at the door that Veld had written in his own flesh and delivered at the cost of his life. Is he still in the system, she said. Deputy level, Shelton said. Different command, still active. Does Phantom Element know? Phantom Element has known for 4 months. They have been building a separate investigation. What happened to you was not isolated. Matlin was not the only case where that order structure was used to eliminate an inconvenient asset under the cover of a hostile designation. A pause that had weight in it. There were others? Briggs looked at Shelton. How long have you known that? 4 months, since Phantom Element brought me into the investigation framework. She looked at him steadily. That is also something I should have told you earlier, and I didn't, because the investigation required compartmentalization. I am telling you now because the operational phase of tonight justifies it, and because she stopped. Started again with the careful honesty of someone who had been precise all day and was being precise now about something that did not benefit from precision but required it anyway. Because Sarah deserved to know that what happened to her was not a mistake. It was a decision, made by a person who made similar decisions with similar outcomes and is still in a position to make them again. The wind came against the outer wall, found its gaps, entered. Corwin stood at the terrain display for a long time without speaking. Briggs watched her and did not see what he might have expected to see. Not anger, not the particular quality of a person absorbing a revelation that changed the shape of everything they had thought they understood. He saw something else. The specific stillness of a person who had already suspected the truth of something for a long time and was now receiving the confirmation, and who found in the confirmation not fresh injury, but a clarification, a completion, the specific relief of knowing that the thing you had been carrying was the shape you had always sensed it to be. After the extraction, she said, when the 3 people on that ridge are home, then we have that conversation about the investigation. Shelton, yes, Corwin, and the conversation will be complete. I want the complete version. You'll have it, Shelton said, all of it. Briggs looked at Corwin and thought about everything that phrase contained. 19 months of carrying something that had been presented to her as an accident, as an intelligence failure, as the kind of outcome that happened when information moved imperfectly through a complex system. 19 months of processing and rebuilding and arriving at a place of readiness and then waiting as advisory coordinator for 8 months for the call sign to be used. The patient and specific endurance of a person who had decided that understanding came before action and who had done the work of understanding completely before she put herself back in a position where another life depended on what she did next. She had not known in those 19 months that it had been a decision rather than a mistake. She had not known that the person who made it was still in the system, still active, still in a position to make similar decisions. She had rebuilt herself on the premise that the system had failed her through error, and she had rebuilt correctly. The rebuild was sound, the capability was restored, the weight was in the right place. None of that changed with the new information. But some things shifted. Not the weight, the understanding of what the weight was for. The command channel opened at 0312. Phantom element actual, direct, the senior voice in the coordination element rather than the duty officer. A voice that said, Phoebe Kellner, the extraction framework has been approved. First light authorization confirmed. Wraith 1, your designation is hereby restored to active status, full clearance, effective immediately. The Phantom element record will reflect that the designation was never appropriately stood down. A pause. That language is deliberate. It goes into the permanent record. Briggs reached for the radio to acknowledge. Corwin put her hand on his arm. Not to stop him. He looked at her. She looked at the radio, then at him. He keyed the transmit. Phantom element actual. This is Phoebe Kellner. Acknowledgement follows. He paused. The pause was not operational. It was the kind of pause that a man took when he was about to say something that needed to be said correctly and needed to be heard correctly. Wraith 1 designation confirmed active. Clearance confirmed full. He paused again. Wraith 1 has been active since the moment she answered the call. The record should reflect that too. The channel was quiet for 4 seconds. Agreed, the Phantom element voice said. It will. Shelton at the workstation behind them stopped typing. She looked at Briggs with the expression of someone watching a person demonstrate something they had not been sure that person was capable of. It was not a condescending expression. It was the expression of being shown that people could surprise you in the correct direction. Corwin looked at Briggs, he looked at her. There was no performance in the moment, no ceremony, just 2 people who had started the day on opposite sides of a door, standing in the same room at 3 in the morning, having become something other than what they had been when the afternoon began. He said, the paperwork takes 48 hours to process through the system. She said, I know. He said, the paperwork doesn't change my answer. She looked at him, those gray eyes, the ones that had given him nothing at the threshold and had given him everything since. I know that too, she said. She went to find a place to sleep. Not the East Wing where advisory staff was billeted. She had been through 2 firing positions and 2 shots in a 4-hour planning session in the particular kind of conversation that took more out of a person than any of those things. And she needed 4 hours of horizontal before the extraction window. The East Wing was on the other side of the compound. She took the bunk room adjacent to the TOC, which was technically for on-call personnel and was currently unoccupied, and she laid down with her jacket on and her bag within arm's reach, and she was asleep in the time it took Briggs to cross the room and turn off the overhead light. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not examine what the moment was. He turned off the light and went back to work. At 0430, Hayes came into the TOC. He was in a sling. He walked carefully with the particular economy of someone whose pain was present and managed rather than absent. And he crossed the room and stood at the terrain display and looked at the Crawford 7 signatures without speaking. He stood there the way a man stood in front of the one thing that had mattered to him for a long time and was still standing. Briggs watched him from the duty station and said nothing. This was not the moment for the conversation about the vehicle accident or the authorization chain or any of the things that were going to need to be examined in the light of day. This was a man at a terrain display in the middle of the night because one of those signatures was a person he had served with for 4 years, and he needed to see with his own eyes that it was still there. It was still there. Hayes stood for a while. Briggs could see the way he was holding himself. Not the economy of a man managing pain, but the specific stillness of a man who had needed to stand in this room and look at this display and know, with the certainty that only direct observation could provide, that the thing he had calculated impact parameters and spent 45 minutes in the frozen dark for was still present, that it had not changed. Then Hayes turned and looked at Briggs. Is she good, he said. He did not specify who he meant. She's asleep, Briggs said. Hayes nodded. Something in his expression settled at that. Not relief exactly, but a particular variety of acceptance. The expression of a man who had entrusted a piece of something important to someone else and was receiving confirmation that the trust had been correctly placed. He looked back at the display one more time, then turned and walked carefully back toward the medical bay. Each step precise and deliberate. A man who had heard himself correctly and was now managing the result with the same precision. At the door, he paused. She was always good, he said. He was not talking about tonight. He was talking about the kind of good that persisted through 19 months of standing down, through the long work of rebuilding, through the specific endurance of a person who understood that the capability and the judgment were 2 different things, and that having one without having done the work on the other was not enough. I know, Briggs said. The 3 on the ridge. Hayes did not look back. His hand was on the doorframe, and his voice had the quality of something that had been held for a long time and was finally being given a specific destination. The one in the middle signature, that's Reyes. We did 4 years together, starting in 2018. A pause. I need you to know that. Briggs looked at the middle thermal signature on the display. The faint point of warmth in the center of 3. Steady. There. I know, he said again. Hayes went out. The door closed behind him with the soft finality of a thing that had been waiting to close. The TOC was quiet for the next 3 hours. The monitors cycled. The thermal signatures on Crawford 7 held their positions. The drone maintained its surveillance pattern, and the data it sent back showed nothing that required immediate attention, which was the best possible thing the data could show at 0400 on the morning before an extraction. Briggs wrote his after-action report for the events of the previous afternoon and evening. He wrote it in the standard format, which had fields for operational summary and personnel involved, and outcome assessment and recommendations for future operations. He filled all the standard fields accurately and completely. In the recommendations section, which was normally used for things like equipment upgrades and protocol modifications and personnel rotations, he wrote the following. It is recommended that designation management at the JSOC level be reviewed with specific attention to the gap between a designation being stood down and a designation being appropriate to stand down. These are not the same determination, and the current process treats them as such. The result of this gap, in the case reviewed here, was 19 months of Wraith 1 carrying active readiness without active designation. The operational cost of this gap, while not quantifiable in terms of this specific mission, is quantifiable in terms of availability. An asset of this capability was unavailable for 19 months, not because the capability was absent, but because the process for recognizing the restoration of readiness did not exist. It should exist. It is recommended that it be created. He reread the section, added one line. The foregoing applies with equal force to any designation of any gender, where the capability exists and the process fails to see it. He submitted the report at 0621, 16 minutes before first light. The 48 hours that followed moved with the specific quality of time in which a thing is being done that needed doing for a long time. Not fast, not slow, with the right weight. The extraction went as planned, which was what happened when plans were built by people who understood exactly what they were building and why each piece was where it was. Phantom Element's ground element moved up the access corridor from Veld's coordinates, while Corwin held overwatch from the northeast approach, and Hayes held overwatch from the southeast. Two people on two ridge lines covering the angles that the terrain required, working in a silence that had been coordinated in the TOC the night before and required no radio traffic to maintain. The three signatures on the Crawford 7 display became three people. Briggs watched the drone feed from the TOC at first light plus 42 minutes and saw the moment when the Phantom Element ground element reached the holding site and made contact. He watched it through the drone's thermal optic, which rendered everything in the blue-gray-white palette of heat against cold, which meant that what he was watching was not visually legible in the normal sense. He could not see faces. He could not see expressions. He could see the specific thermal geometry of human bodies moving toward each other, and he could see the signatures clustered together in the particular way of people who were in the same space and aware of each other, and no longer separated by the structure that had kept them apart. He found that this was enough, more than enough. The extraction took 6 minutes once contact was established. All three members of the original Kingfisher insertion team were ambulatory, which the medical pre-brief had assessed as a 40% likelihood, given the duration of their captivity, in the conditions of a high-altitude holding site in winter. They were ambulatory and they were coherent, and they moved under their own power to the secondary LZ 3 kilometers south where the medical team had staged, and the drone followed them every step of the way. When the last of the three thermal signatures cleared the approach corridor and began the movement toward the LZ, Briggs heard Corwin's voice on the Overwatch channel. She did not say anything tactical. She did not report a change in conditions or a threat assessment or a wind reading. She said quietly and precisely the specific words that constituted the only appropriate thing to say in a moment when something that had been broken for 19 months was in the process of being repaired. "That's all of them," she said. "They're moving." That was all. The mountain held its silence around them the way it always held its silence, indifferent and patient and unchanged by the hours of human urgency that had moved across its surface. The snow that had fallen the night before was undisturbed on the higher elevations, white and clean and honest in the way that fresh snow was always honest, covering nothing permanently, concealing nothing that the spring would not eventually find and return to the light. On the Crawford Ridgeline, the holding site that had contained 3 American service members for 19 months was empty. The thermal signatures that had persisted through 6 weeks of surveillance and 10 days of attribution and 1 night of operational decision-making were gone from the display, because the warmth that had made them was now somewhere else, moving south toward a landing zone and medical personnel and whatever came next. The display showed only cold. Briggs stood at the terrain display in the TOC long after the drone feed confirmed extraction complete, and the medical team reported 3 ambulatory, 3 coherent, 3 en route to the primary care facility at Edgerton Air Base. He stood there the way he had stood at the window before dawn, taking the measure of what had changed. The display showed the Crawford Ridgeline, clear and quiet, a terrain feature in the San Gabriel Mountains in February with nothing remarkable about it except that it had, for 173 days after the first thermal signatures were logged by a passive sensor sweep, contained something that mattered very much to a specific set of people. Shelton came to stand beside him. She looked at the display, at the empty ridgeline. "The investigation," he said. "I'll have everything compiled within 72 hours, she said. "Phantom Element has an authorized channel. Everything goes through that channel and nothing else." She paused. "The name in the signature block, the other cases, the full record." She asked for the complete version. "She'll have it." Briggs nodded. He thought about what it meant to have the complete version of a thing. He thought about Corwin on the Crawford Overwatch position, on the ridgeline in the cold at first light, watching the approach corridor and holding her angle and doing the work that she had been ready to do for 8 months before anyone called the designation. He thought about what she had said about the weight, that the weight was supposed to be there, that the weight was how you knew you understood what you were doing. He thought about what it meant to understand something completely, and about the difference between carrying weight that had been given to you by an error and carrying weight that had been placed on you by a decision. Both were real. Both stayed. The difference was what you did with the understanding once you had it. She came into the TOC at 0842. She was carrying her bag over her left shoulder, the strap worn smooth. She had cleaned up and she had slept, and she moved with the same absence of urgency that she had moved with when she came up the access road the previous afternoon. But the quality of that absence was different now. Yesterday, it had been the absence of urgency that belonged to a person waiting for the thing they had prepared for to arrive. Today, it was something else. The absence of urgency that belonged to a person who had completed the thing they prepared for and was now simply present in the ordinary world, which had weight and texture and value of its own. She set her bag down near the door, looked at the display, at the empty ridgeline. "How are they?" she said. "All three ambulatory when they reach the LZ. Medical team reports stable. Edgerton has them now." He paused. "Names will come through official channels in a few hours." She nodded. "Hayes," she said. "Talking about full duty status by the end of the week," Briggs said, "which the medical officer says is optimistic and Hayes says is accurate." "Hayes is right," she said. Briggs looked at her. She was looking at the display, at the clean blue-gray terrain of a ridgeline that was once again simply a ridgeline. 4 kilometers northeast, 8,400 feet. North-facing slope with natural concealment in 3 directions. A place where a drone had found 3 small points of warmth 6 weeks ago and had changed the shape of everything that followed. "What happens now?" he said. She considered the question. Not quickly. With the same deliberate attention she gave to wind calculations and terrain assessments and the other things that deserve to be considered fully before being answered. "The paperwork clears in 48 hours, she said. "Designation active. Full clearance confirmed." She paused. "And then I work." "Where?" She looked at him, those gray eyes. "Phantom Element decides the assignment, but I've made a request. To stay in this sector. To stay in this sector." He understood why. The investigation had a name at the top of it, and the name was still active in the system, and there was work to be done in understanding what had happened and what it had cost and making the case that would be required to hold someone accountable for a decision that had produced 19 months of a Crawford ridgeline and an unknown number of other cases built on the same architecture. That work required a person with first-hand knowledge of at least one instance. It required a person who understood the complete version. It required Sarah Corwin to be in a position to give the complete version when the time came. "Then you should know something," he said. "I'm submitting a supplemental to my after-action report, the section on designation management." He paused. "Your name is in it, the correct name." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said, "I didn't have to." Outside, the wind that had been steady since before dawn was dropping, not gone. Dropping, going from the sustained lateral push of a mountain winter in full force to something gentler, more vertical. The specific quality of February mountain air after the front had passed, and what remained was the ordinary cold. The kind that was simply weather, simply what was present, neither adversarial nor welcoming, just the condition under which the work was done. The snow on the compound was unmarked again. Clean, the tracks from the night before, the footprints and vehicle impressions, and the 2 patches of disturbed ground near the walls had been covered by the night's accumulation and were no longer visible. The compound looked the way compounds looked when nothing had recently happened in them. Quiet, white, ordinary. But in the after-action reports, in the Phantom Element operational logs, in the classified case file that Shelton was going to compile in the next 72 hours, in the designation record that now reflected an active status that had never appropriately been stood down, in all of those places, the record of what had happened was permanent. A call sign answered from outside a closed door. 2 shots at distances the base roster said were impossible. 3 people, ambulatory, moving south toward a landing zone on the morning of the 48th hour after a woman in a charcoal jacket with no insignia walked up an access road without urgency and sat on a concrete wall in the wind and waited. The record did not fade with the snow. Briggs walked to the window and looked out at the white compound and thought about all of that. Thought about 14 years of standing indoors and reading badges and making the call that the protocol required. He thought about what it meant to stand in a door correctly and still be wrong about what was on the other side of it. He thought about the difference between a system that failed and a person who let the system do the seeing for them, and he thought about what he was going to do differently. He thought about a woman standing in the wind with her left hand open and her fingers spread, reading something that the instruments were getting wrong. He thought about what that looked like from the outside and what it required of the person doing it. And he thought about how long she had been ready to do it before anyone gave her the designation back. He thought, not again. Not for this woman. Not in this sector. Not while he was standing in the doorway. Corwin picked up her bag. She was heading to the armory to check in her equipment. the final procedural step in the transition from operational to administrative status, which the designation paperwork would complete in 48 hours. She had made the request to stay in sector. The request was in the system. The system would process it at whatever speed it processed things, which was rarely the speed that the situation required, but which produced outcomes that were binding in the ways that mattered. At the door, she paused. She looked back at Briggs. He was at the window. He had not moved from the window. He was looking out at the white compound with the expression of a man who had arrived at something and was not yet done arriving. She said, "I'll be back for the briefing." He turned from the window. "I know," he said. She went out. The door closed. At FOB Kellner's command station, the designation record for Wraith 1 showed active status. The field that normally contained the date of restoration contained the current date. Alongside it, in a notation that Phantom Element had added at 03:12 that morning, was a single line in the administrative section. Designation was never appropriately stood down, record corrected accordingly. The record reflected what was accurate. It always should have. On the terrain display, the Crawford Ridgeline was empty and clean and unchanged by everything that had moved across it in the last 48 hours. 4 kilometers northeast, 8,400 feet, north-facing, patient. Somewhere to the south, 3 people who had existed as thermal signatures on a monitor for 6 weeks were in a medical facility at Edgerton Air Base, which was warm and had doctors and had coffee and had all the ordinary things that people needed after a long time in a place that had none of those things. The display showed only terrain. Shelton, at her workstation, opened the investigation file. The name at the top of it, the name she had been given with orders she had followed and had not followed far enough, was there. It would remain there with everything attached to it until the case was built correctly and completely and submitted through the authorized channel, and the person it named was no longer in a position to give the same order to someone else. That was the work. It was going to take time. It was going to require someone who understood the complete version. She began to compile it, and Briggs turned from the window, and for the first time that morning, he looked at something other than the compound outside. He looked at the doorway. It was empty, open, the ordinary rectangle of a door through which people moved in both directions, unremarkable, functional, doing nothing more or less than what a door was supposed to do. He thought, this is where it started. This is where he had stood with his hand on the frame and his eyes on a badge, and a woman had stopped and looked at him with gray eyes that gave him nothing, and then turned and sat on a concrete wall in the wind and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that some doors opened eventually, if you were still there when they did. He thought about the next person who came up that road. He thought about what it meant to stand in a doorway correctly. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The snow was still. The February air had cleared to something clean and cold and honest. The kind of cold that did not ask anything of you except to know it was there. Wraith 1 was on standby. That was all that needed to be said. That moment when Briggs stepped aside and let her through, that one hit me hard. 14 years of doing everything by the book, and it took one radio call to show him the book wasn't the whole story. I've been thinking about it ever since I wrote it. Question for you, was Shelton right to keep Sarah in the dark for 8 months? Or did she owe her the truth from day one? Drop your answer below. And if stories like this are your kind of thing, the ones that don't make the headlines but should, hit subscribe. The next one is already in the works.